Hey everybody, it's Monday morning, the 18th. I assume that most of you are focused on your exam today, I hope, since it's due by midnight tonight. So I thought I would just take a few minutes to comment real briefly on the four topics we discussed in the chapters leading up to this exam. We talked about language, we talked about nature versus nurture, we talked about sex, and we talked about the different types of social groups that humans form. And I'm just going to talk about each one of them pretty quickly. I'll go into a little bit more detail on a couple and skim over the others. I thought that most of you did a really nice job with the language discussion. I mean, certainly the idea of a universal language is nice. It would seem like it would simplify communication, but then, as most of you noticed, when you really kind of break it down, it becomes problematic. On the one hand, there are certain words that simply don't translate from one language to another, certain concepts or certain ideas. Somebody mentioned in their thread posting, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it is, but speaking Polish. And the idea that you can tell a joke in Polish, but when you translate it in English, it's just not funny anymore. And that is emblematic of the challenge of coming up with the universal language, is how do we incorporate all the nuance that exists within languages that already are in existence. And that becomes even more challenging for languages that are even further and further related to one another. I mean, English and Polish are not exceptionally far apart in the grand tree of languages, the family tree of languages, but if you're talking about English and Urdu or English and not a language only spoken in a Polynesian island by a few hundred speakers, it certainly becomes more problematic. And then, of course, the idea that any switch to a universal language would certainly come with a cultural cost. I think that was really well represented in many of your responses. I did like the thought that some of you had that maybe it would be a worthwhile effort to do it to encourage people to learn a second language. If we had some sort of universal language that everybody could learn as a second language, I guess hypothetically that might be one way that we could get around that challenge of not asking people to completely give up their language and their culture and as a consequence of it, but having some sort of I think somebody mentioned in one of your threads Esperanto. That idea has been around for a long time, coming up with a universal language that everybody knows sort of as a second language. Now, moving on to nature versus nurture, that was an interesting conversation, and it always is an interesting conversation. And I think just about everybody agreed that nurture was most important. And I think there is a lot of reasons why we tend to think that way. We like to feel like we have some sort of sense of control, as it were, over the person who we are going to become. That our personality isn't just something that's carved onto our DNA and is sort of preordained by whatever our genetics are. Having said that, it's true that you can't say it's either nature or nurture. Both nature and nurture play a very important role. However, those of you who argued that nurture was overwhelmingly responsible for your personality were emphasizing nurture a little bit too heavily. It's much more likely that it's a 50-50 relationship, or a 45-55. For some traits, genetics is going to be far more impactful. For other traits, nurture may be, but overwhelmingly, it's more of a middle of the road kind of 50-50 split. And as some of the examples, I mean, what is one of the most important factors that determines your personality? It's your sex. The second you come out of your mother and your sex is determined, the way the world treats you changes. And there are all sorts of other physical traits that people respond to. We've already talked about race, certainly your skin color, your hair color, whether you're perceived as attractive or not by your society. All those things factor into the way you are treated. So even though your genetics might not decide your personality in that regard, they certainly are a filter through which nurture passes through. So because of your sex, people treat you differently, so it filters the way you're nurtured. Because of your skin color, your hair color, whether you're thin or whether you're heavy, whether you're attractive or not by the standards of your society, all those become a filter through which nurture is passed in the way that people treat you. And that certainly impacts your personality, but it's your genetics that is that filter. And then one of the things that not many people touched on, and I was a little disappointed, nobody seemed interested in discussing Hitler's testicles. And I threw that thread on there to sort of illustrate a point. I was serious, there is legitimate historical research into whether or not Adolf Hitler had a single testicle. So why? Why do people care? And the reason why people care, it's the same reason why when something horrible happens, like happened in Dallas last week, or happened in Baton Rouge yesterday, or happened at Sandy Hook 4 years ago, or any of these horrible events where there's a mass shooting, or there's a truck driver who runs over 84 people in Nice, France, or whatever, we look at the individual and we try to find something wrong with them. Because it's scary to think, okay, here's Adolf Hitler. He murdered 11 million people, and he's just like me. That's really scary. So we want to find something about that person that they did wrong or was wrong with them that would explain that behavior. Because the implication is, if Hitler was just like me, then I could do the same thing that Hitler could do. And when you boil it down, that's the challenge of nurture, or that's the implication of nurture. If it is really 90% nurture, or 85% nurture, or whatever, then what you're telling me is your sex doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl, male or female. Your sexual orientation doesn't matter, because all that stuff, I can make you whatever I want. If it is truly mostly nurture, I can shape your environment in such a way that your outcome will be what I want it to be. So for example, you might be a girl, but if I want you to act as a boy, then from the moment you're born, if I just treat you as a boy, then you're going to grow up as a boy. Or vice versa. That proud father whose wife gives birth to a son and he really wanted a daughter, so he puts his son in dresses and he gives him dolls and everything's in pink and introduces him as a girl and gives him a girl's name. That will certainly impact that person's personality, but they're still a boy. And being a boy is going to overwhelm much of what that father might try to do through nurturing. Now, obviously, that's kind of an extreme example, but it illustrates this point that as important as nurture is, the implications are significant. And it can be anything. It doesn't just have to be, sex and sexual orientation. It can be, superstar athletes are superstar athletes partly because, a large part because they have a genetic makeup that enables them to do that. My parents may have really liked the idea of me being choose your sport, an NFL quarterback. And they could have raised me as much as they wanted to be an NFL quarterback, but I simply didn't have those physical skills. So we can't simply say that, well, it's how you're raised. Because as much as I said before, as much as we like to think that our parents and the messages that they give us and the lessons that they treat us are so impactful, and that may be true, many of those messages and those lessons are being driven by our parents' own genetics and their own biology. And since we inherited those traits, we are likely to respond to those messages. Having said that, it's not to say that nurture isn't important, because it can take those genetic characteristics and it can direct them into a positive or a negative direction. So, for example, you might have two men, and they're both born, and they both have a genetic predisposition to being aggressive and to being violent. One of those men is in an environment where his aggression and his violence is steered into athletics, and that person becomes a successful NFL player. Because socially, we say, hey, violence is okay on the NFL playing field. So if you're a violent person out on the NFL playing field, that's great. You're going to be socially rewarded for that. The other person, his violence and his aggression isn't channeled into a positive direction, and he ends up starting off as a juvenile delinquent and over time escalating into more and more violent crimes, and ultimately he commits some sort of horrific crime and he winds up in prison. Two men, hypothetically with the same genetic driver behind their actions, but being socially steered in different directions. So it is important to recognize, as most of you did, that it's not either nature or nurture, but we can't place as much emphasis on nurture as many of you did. It's far closer to 50-50, and as I said, for some traits, it's quite likely that it's overwhelmingly the genetic influence, the genetic input that shapes that part of our personality. So let's move on to sex, shall we? Sex is interesting for a number of reasons. Mostly because I think just about universally every one of you in your comment section or in your discussion post said, yeah, sex is for reproduction. And yeah, it is, biologically speaking, but is that why humans have sex? And what sex is, among all other things, is a really good example of this idea of ritualization. That humans have taken this basic biological function, the need to reproduce, and we have ritualized it in a way that we've taken it out of its biological realm, if you will, and we have given it importance and given it meaning beyond that. So, I mean, yeah, reproduction is important. It is an important byproduct of sex. But in humans, particularly in the 21st century, the reason that we have, and really even well before the 21st century, for as long as there have been humans, the reasons that we have sex often don't have anything to do with reproduction. More often than not, when two people are intimate with one another, they're not doing it because they want to reproduce. They're doing it because they're bored. They're doing it because they're tired. They're doing it because they're attracted to one another. They're doing it for the thrill. They're doing it because they're lonely. They're doing it for any number of different reasons. But reproduction is usually not very high on that list. And that discussion segued into the discussion about marriage. And in that discussion, one of the things that came out in many of your comments was this idea of, sex should be saved for marriage, somebody that you're in love with, and marriage is important because it's a way for you to express being in love with somebody. And I think that is a common idea that we have, particularly in the United States, this idea that you're supposed to find this one person that you will be in love with, and you're going to be in love with them for the rest of your life, and you're going to spend your lives together. But that's also a really high standard, and it's also not something that's been universal either in the United States or around the world. I mean, this idea of being in love with somebody is relatively unimportant until quite recently. Even in the United States, people married for economic and political and social reasons, and if they fell in love, great, but as long as they had the security of being in a marriage, that was often enough. And I think it puts a lot of pressure on us in our modern age that we're socialized to think that I have to be in love with this person. So what happens if 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, you suddenly realize you're not in love with that person? You both have changed. Your life courses have gone in unexpected directions. Does that mean that your marriage is a failure or that the marriage should end? And I think we have to come to this idea, this acceptance that it's okay for, a lot of successful marriages. I suspect my neighbors recently celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, and they definitely love one another in the way that two people who are very familiar with each other and have shared a lot with one another and have suffered and struggled and worked and succeeded and all those things together for so long do. But this idea that they're passionately in love with one another, like, again, we have this notion people are supposed to be married. Um, I don't. I think they wouldn't say that that's what they have. It doesn't diminish their relationship, and it doesn't suggest that marriage is any less important to them or for them. It just illustrates that I think we have these cultural ideas inspired by media and movies and music and everything else that are a little bit unrealistic about what marriage really looks like. And then, having said that, many of you also mentioned divorce and the problem of divorce. And one of the things that's kind of interesting, again, I think I mentioned this in one of my posts, was that in the United States today, more young people report that marriage isn't as important to them. More young people are waiting longer to get married. Some young people are saying, I don't even need to be married. I can be in a relationship with somebody. We can have kids. We can be committed to one another without having to be married. So young people do seem to be waiting longer to get married. At the same time, people who are waiting longer to get married are also staying married longer. We hear this number that the divorce rate in the United States is around 50%, and that's true, sort of. If you look back at people who were married in the 1970s and the 1980s, about between 55 and 60% of those marriages ended before they reached the 15th year. By comparison, people who were married in the 1990s and as recently as 2000, and I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but only about 30% of those marriages are ending at the 15th year, by the 15th year. So one of the things that we seem to be seeing is while the marriage rate is declining a little bit, people are waiting longer to get married, those marriages that have occurred are likely to last longer. So we bat this 50% divorce statistic around a lot, and it is sort of true over the long term, but when you break it down by decades, you see that the divorce rate has actually been declining in the United States as people seem to wait longer to get married, and they get married for different reasons. Women don't have to get married anymore. The whole idea of getting through high school and then finding a husband to support them and things like that, they don't have to do that anymore. Women having access to education, having access to careers, having access to reliable contraception, all those things have enabled women to make other life choices, to be successful on their own without the pressure building to be married to define that success. And that allows women to wait longer to get married, men as well, but it allows women to wait longer to get married. People delay having children, and it seems as if people getting married later in life is a recipe for longer term, more successful marriages. Time will tell. And then last but not least, I just want to talk real briefly about the whole social groups question. What I was really trying to get at, or hope came across as you were talking about the social group thing, is one of the challenges that we face, and you're going to see it. You can see it now if you read the news or look at social media. Certainly, as the presidential campaigns ramp up even more, it will become apparent. But one of the things that humans struggle with is that we live in a environment that isn't really one we're well suited for. And this was kind of touched on when I asked the question about cities a couple chapters ago, living in cities and whether or not that made sense. We live in environments where we are surrounded by people, and yet humans are at our best when we're in smaller groups, when we're in groups of 30, 50, maybe 100 people, up to maybe about 400 people seems to be about the ideal community size for humans. Because in those communities, we can at least know everybody. And when we get in communities that are much larger than that, it's hard because we don't know everybody that we pass on the street. So we don't have a familiarity with them. We don't have any personal connection with them. They're just a stranger. And that increases social anxiety and stress and things like that. So what it kind of boils down to is we form these interest groups, these common interest groups, out of both common interests, but sort of this innate need that we have, because humans at our most basic level are tribal. We call our tribes all sorts of different things these days. They're our sports teams, or the sports teams that we root for, or there are, the knitting club, or the reading group, or the choir, or whatever special interest organization that we become a part of. But it's a small community of people with similar interests, and our loyalty is there. And we tend to look at other communities that might be of similar interest but are different than our own with a little bit of suspicion. So, you're a Red Sox fan, so those pesky Yankee fans, they can't be trusted because the Yankees are a bunch of cheaters and they don't do things the right way, and really only Red Sox fans are true baseball fans, or whatever the interest group may be. So this tribal nature of being human means that in a society like the United States with 350 million people, there is no idea, there's really no one thing of what it means to be a citizen of the United States. 350 million people are not alike, and it creates tensions, and it creates rivalries, and it creates opportunities, and it creates a whole social fabric that is really complex in the way it's woven together. But when it works its best, these individual tribes that we belong to, and understand that we can be members of multiple tribes. So you can be a member of the tribe that is your work community, and you can be a member of a tribe that is your church community, and you can be a member of a tribe that's your softball team, and you can be a member of a tribe that's your book club. Again, whatever organizations you're a part of, and the membership of those organizations may not overlap, but when you are in that organization, that's where your loyalty lies. That's where your commitment is to. And the times where we feel the most stress tends to be when two of those groups that we're a part of come into some sort of conflict with one another, and we're left in a situation where we have to make a choice. If it's just my tribe against somebody else's tribe, it's the Red Sox fans against the Yankees fans, it's pretty clear cut. But if I'm a member of both, the Red Sox fan group and the New York Giants, oh gosh, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the New York Giants fan group, and all those people in the Red Sox fan group are also Patriots fans. So now there's a rivalry because I have to pick and choose. Is it more important to be a Red Sox fan, or is it more important to be a Giants fan? Then we have a problem. And this is where this question of special interest group or common interest groups becomes important. And you can see in the nature of how things play out in our political realm, or how things play out in our social realm or in the news, you can see this tribal nature at work in the way people latch on to groups or ideas or communities that share their common interest. And it often means that people might not be making decisions based on the best information. They're doing so based on their loyalty to a particular group. And as we move forward in politics, power, and violence, we'll be able to see, hopefully, how that can create some challenges. So once again, I will post this in the video section, and I will put a thread up in the discussion if you have any thoughts or comments on anything that I have had to say. As always, there was a lot more that I wanted to say, but I did want to keep this relatively short, and I hope it is useful for you. And also good luck on your exam, and we will talk, I hope, soon.